This is the Kaduna Book and Arts Festival 2022 Kabafest. You are welcome to my book chat with Mr. Umar Turaki, the author of Such a Beautiful Thing to Behold. Mr. Umar, thank you for honoring our invitation. It's amazing to have you here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm excited today to be talking with you about the book Such a Beautiful Thing to Behold, which is your debut novel. When I got it, I said I was just going to flip through, read a chapter or two, and then come back later. But I opened it and I did not close it till I got to the end. I cried a little bit, full confession. It was an experience. I think that's the easiest way to explain it. And I'm excited to converse with you as regards this book today. Thank you.
No, thank you.
So my first question for you would be, how was the experience for you transitioning from writing for TV to becoming a novelist? Because I read somewhere when you were announcing Such a Beautiful Thing to Behold, you said your deepest, most precious dream of 20 years was finally coming true. So tell us about your journey to being a novelist, the transition process from writing for TV and screen to actually being a published author.
What a lot of people don't know is that I actually started out as a fiction writer. My first attempt at writing anything was when I was 14. And I just got this bright idea in my head that I wanted to write. And so I started, writing a book, and I worked on this, what would be my first attempt at a novel. I worked on it over a period of 2.5 years or so. And by the time I was 16, I was able to get this book printed. I was in secondary school at the time, and the proprietress of my school was very supportive, the late Mariam Babangida, and she printed like a number of copies and gave them to me, and I sold them, and it was just such an affirming time for me as an aspiring writer. So that was kind of the beginning, and it was after that that I actually started working on, in film and trying to be a filmmaker from my early 20s, and that eventually took the front seat. It just seemed like a more practical way of, trying to make a living, rather than just writing books, and how hard it is. So I basically spent most of my 20s, trying to position myself as a screenwriter, writing for TV, for film, in the industry. It was sort of after 10 years, in the background, I was working on my fiction writing. So it wasn't that I started, with film and then I sort of made this big jump, right? It was something that I was doing, I was doing both of them, sometimes intermittently. When the book deal came through, I realized I did not know, I wasn't keeping track of time. I did not realize, that it had taken 20 years. And it was just sort of looking at that, and just seeing, and there was almost like a nice symmetry to it, like, you were coming back full circle to this thing that you had started with. So I think that's what that tweet meant.
Amazing. So you just mentioned an affirming experience that you had when you were, I think, about 16, where your book was printed. How did getting the book deal with Little A, how did it feed into that sense of being affirmed as a writer? What were your emotions in that time when you got the deal?
When the book deal came through, my first reaction was I got the email like 11 p.m. at night or something, some very late hour. And I just went and I lay on the floor of my study, laid flat on my back, and I just stared at the ceiling for like 15 minutes, just processing what I had just read. And I called my wife and told her about it. And her reaction was because she's a very different, personality. She was just screaming. And I honestly can't put into words this affirmation that you kind of set yourself on this path. You tell yourself this is something you want to do, but there are key moments where you are really plagued with self-doubt. And I'm sure it's the case for everybody. And then these special moments come along, and whether it's getting, those 500 copies, I think it was 1,000 copies that Mariam Babangida, the late Mariam Babangida, gifted to me, or whether it's getting into the Farafina Creative Writing Workshop organized by, formerly organized by Chimamanda. And those moments come along and they kind of remind you that, okay, maybe I actually have a shot at this. And the book deal, it was no different.
Amazing. So at this point, we would like to get a little insight into the book, and we would love for you to read an excerpt, especially when you introduce the concept of the gray, which is like the central theme of the book. Would like you to read maybe a passage from the book talking about the gray, and then we can continue the conversation.
I always have a headache choosing where to read from. So it's good that you asked about the gray, because I'll just start in the beginning. So this is chapter 1. The gray-ridden neighbor, Nanariddunen, licked her lips and parted them to continue speaking. Dunka sat on the floor at her feet, his whole spirit leaning in so he could hear her when she spoke. His body, however, he held back. Hope was an easier burden to carry if you did not put your all into it. They were in her bedroom. She sat on a white plastic chair with flimsy arms that folded like paper if you put too much weight on them. The name he was waiting to hear was like a secret too heavy to leave her tongue. Nanaridunen's eyes were already black and void, like 2 holes inside her head. Her strength had all but failed, and Dunka was certain she was blind, even if she would not admit it. Rit, his sister and Nanaridunen's namesake, would bring her what tiny meals they could spare and help her clean. Nanariddunen was the closest thing they had to a mother, as she had liked to remind them back when she could still walk from her front door, across their backyard, past their father's sky blue pickup truck and place where their mother was buried, and into the kitchen. Once inside, she would call out the children's names and wait for them to emerge from their rooms. If she came with some food, she would place it on the countertop and order them to get to eating. If she had nothing, she would ask them whether they needed anything before turning around and going back home. It had taken several months for the gray to reduce her to this point, where she had just enough strength to migrate between her bed and the white chair, and barely enough to speak a string of words. 15 Goma Street, Pagak, but they call her Matien, Nanariddunen said at last. There it was, the name and address of the woman who lived in the next village. The woman who might save Dunka and his siblings from the gray. Nanariddunen had stressed might, saying there was nothing to lose in trying. As though reading his mind, she added, it's too late for you and me, but if she can help the others, it will be a good thing. Back in his room, Dunka studied his eyes in the knife-sized sliver that was all that remained of his father's mirror. He had first seen the gray lodged in them 2 days ago. There had been more relief for him than fear at that moment, because he had been waiting for it. But the waiting had been its own kind of terror. He looked around his room. It had been his father's room first. He was seeing the objects in the room, but at the same time not seeing them. His gaze had been rendered a monochromatic silver by the gray. The gray did that. It stole the color from your eyes as it killed you quietly. He stared at the toneless room and its profusion of belongings, clothes, a handful of school books, furniture, the paper ceiling, failing to differentiate between what had been his father's and what had always been his, and how the two had become one. With the gray now inside him, nothing mattered any longer. Not even Nanaridunen's words and the fleeting hope they had puffed into him. He took a long walk in no particular direction, paying little attention to his surroundings. It had rained about 4 weeks ago, and that initial single rainfall had been so brief that it had barely soaked the ground and had failed to make the fields come alive. When the rain ended, he had stood by the flame tree near the house, gazing toward the 5-kilometer stretch of wilderness that lay between their village, Pilam, and the next village, Pishan, wondering how long it would take to see green fields again. That had been before he'd gotten the gray, before he had lost all hope of ever seeing color again. Now everything was drab and leaden, like in those old black and white films that had sometimes aired on television in the afternoons when their lives had been normal and they'd had electricity. He grew tired of walking and circled his way back home, collapsing on his bed and falling asleep.
So as you were reading, I was remembering the exact emotions I felt when I started to read the book. And I have so many questions about the gray, so many. But let me start with the concept of the gray. Is it symbolic? Is it literal? What was the process behind that? Did you have to do medical research? What was the process that led into that focal point?
I started writing it as a short story, I think about 11 or 12 years before it got published. At the time, I can't entirely, put into words like what sort of led to the generation of, of the idea of the gray. But I can speak to sort of certain, extenuating circumstances and things that were happening, at the time for me. And at that time, I had just finished working on what was essentially my second attempt at writing a novel. And I was walking away, from that experience feeling a bit, I don't know, just bruised and depressed, because I just didn't feel like, I'd written something really good. I wasn't very happy with it. So I felt that perhaps it was time for me to sort of go back to the drawing board and work on short fiction. As I mentioned earlier, my first attempt at writing anything was to sit down and write a book. I'd never really tried to do short fiction seriously. So in my head, I thought, okay, fine, I would work on something, hopefully that would allow me to, cut my teeth and sort of just get better at it, at this craft. And the first story I worked on was a short story called The Gray. A few years later, I think I would sort of understand, maybe certain influences I think that had come through. A book that had a big influence on me at that time was Cormac McCarthy's The Road. And if you read that book, it's a very dark book in a very sort of interesting, weird, twisted way. It's a hopeful book, but it's a book that drags you through the slog and through the mire of just human depravity and everything to bring you to hope. So when I kind of look at that, I'm like, okay, that's a possible influence. I think that had something to do, I don't know, with the idea of the gray. Another book that I would eventually sort of understand was Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy. And in the second book of that trilogy, there's this interesting idea because, they're fantasy books and they played such a huge part in my growing up and in my aspirations as a writer. And in the second book, there's this part where these strange beings, right, that for some reason children are not able to see them. But once adults begin to sort of enter adolescence, they begin to attract them, and they're called specters. And these specters sort of begin to come along and suck away basically like the will to live, for want of a better word. And in retrospect, I realized, okay, maybe that may have been an influence as well, right? But all of this was really, I think, very subliminal and just happening in the background. Yeah, so that's, I don't know, I think that's probably the best explanation I have.
Awesome, amazing. I was going to ask why children were not affected, but I think with the explanation of the spectre, I'm at peace with that question. So I like that the book was filled with themes that everyone can relate with, from love to loss to finding courage and helplessness. So if you were to pick one lesson that you would like the people that read this book, the readers, to leave the experience of this book with, what would that focal point be for you?
By the time I decided that I wanted to expand the story and the world, one word that just kept coming up for me was wonder. I wanted it in a way to be a meditation on the idea of wonder and beauty and where you find these things. And my own conviction is that found in the least likely of places and, places that we take for granted often. We spend so much of our lives, looking for happiness and things that make us happy. And we fritter away so much time, when a lot of these things are really in front of us. And it really just depends on how you're able to look, and how you're able to see. Seeing is a huge part of the book, outlook, what you see, and the impact that has on you.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned wonder. And I think that for many people, the older we get, which again is in keeping with the kids being immune to it, the older we get, the I think we tend to lose that sense. So, why do you think that the concept of wonder was important for you in writing this book to highlight, especially in the context that we're in? People are recovering from COVID. There's a lot of things happening, especially in Nigeria, with a lot of avoidable tragedies. Speak about wonder a little more. I think would like to see how we can apply that when everything looks dark and there just doesn't seem to be a way out.
This idea of small things, small joys, small pleasures of life, I think those are essential, building blocks of our happiness. And we're always sort of out there, pursuing that big achievement, that pot of gold, whatever it may be. The most successful people that achieved these things that most of us, sort of look at with envy, they will tell you it is not enough. I've been married for about almost 4 years now, and in that time I've become a father, and just those experiences they've really sort of proven to me, these feelings I've had about things, and they brought it home that these small things, these components, these relationships. I like watching sunrises. I think that's in sunsets. That's why probably they feature so much in the book. I like the taste of food. I like different kinds of food. I like relishing, these things. I like texture. I like music. These are all things that are within our reach, and we, and I think that if you're able to just have the right kind of outlook, you realize that life is it's really such a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's a gift, and you're blessed. I think because it's not a big thing. It's the little things.
So I read somewhere, and this is a quote from you. You said, "It took me a whole novel to finally understand that the biggest factor shaping my thematic obsession is my familial experiences, both the good and the bad." Tolstoy wrote that all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And you went on to say, it would seem that the question of family is most compelling when there is unhappiness involved. My own interest as a writer is in rifling through that unhappiness to reach healing and wholesomeness. As my own life experience has shown me, this is not only possible, but necessary. I have read your portion from the book of This Our Country, and I love that you mentioned your daughter because she was featured in that post. So I see that family is an integral part of, as you have said, it forms almost the core of your thematic leaning. So, did you experience a sense of catharsis when you were writing this book? I mean, this is a feature novel. It's not a short story. It's not for TV. It really is just you pouring yourself on the page. So, what was the experience of writing about family in this sense as it applies in the book?
I think just to kind of echo from that quote that you read, the fact is, I did not know I was writing about family until after the fact, until after I sort of, sat back and I began to get feedback from people. I thought I was writing about the gray. I thought I was, writing just about the idea of beauty and wonder and all of that. But really, what kind of came out, and I think that it's because that's what was there. Was family, and after the fact that I began to sort of, I guess, like connect the dots and, look at the progression of the ideas of the novel and beginning to match them with my own, life experiences, my relationships with, my siblings, sort of coping, with the loss of my father, those kinds of things. So it was after looking, and after that I don't know. I don't know if catharsis is the word, to be honest, but, there was a moment where I just realized that, okay, there's more. And I felt like I was beginning to see properly, I felt like I was beginning to get a better grasp of my voice as a writer and the things that matter to me as a writer.
So you mentioned in an interview that the book was, in essence, a love letter to your mother, and that many of the female characters were inspired by her. So, tell us a little bit about why she plays such an important role in your writing?
My mom is my hero. I lost my father when I was 11 or so, and and there's two of us. I have a younger sister, and just sort of watching her, and I think I was a very, I don't know, I was a very aware, I was a very self-aware kid. So I was noticing these things. I was noticing the changes. When my father was sick with cancer, I sort of heard it, I was hearing these things and noticing these changes. And so after his passing, just sort of seeing her gather herself and sort of try to stand up, because he was the breadwinner, and try to fill that gap. And what's interesting about her own life, I always think about her own experiences, because she lost her own parents before she was 10, and she had two younger siblings. And by the time she was a teenager, she had to become a mother to them. And seeing that, and just seeing how, over the years, she became a mother, not just to me, and to her siblings, but to many people that would come into her life. And she just became that sort of central figure. And when I decided that I wanted to be a writer, she supported me, and it seems so, casual. Like, of course, your mother would support you, but, we're Africans, and we know, Nigerians, we know how parents tend to be about these kinds of things. They want you to get a more practical kind of job, more practical training and things like that. And she supported me, with things. I would tell her I needed these hefty tomes for research, and she would, and this was in the early 2000s, and she would give me 10,000 naira to go and buy these books, and it's not like plucking money from trees, right? I wanted to sort of center the cultural, some of the cultural identity that I gotten from her, because she is Ngas from Plateau State. I grew up in Plateau State. And so I wanted to center the language. I don't speak it. I don't really speak it, I don't speak it. I understand some of it, but I wanted to center the language. I wanted to take the names. I wanted to sort of make the language its own character in the book. And it was my own way of just honoring her and honoring, what she's given me.
So let's talk about Pilam for a second. You've mentioned that you wanted that incorporating the gas language was a way of honoring your mom. But why did you pick the setting that it had? So when I started reading it, I got this post-apocalyptic sense. And then when I got to the part where there was a pickup truck, my brain almost froze. I'm like, wait, what year are we in? So I had that experience, and I would like to know what informed your decision to place the book in a time where there's TV, there are cars, and there's, the internet and all these things. Why did you pick the period you did to write about Pilam and the Grey?
So initially, I actually thought that, I think the first iterations of this story, even like back when it was like a short story, it was set in some nondescript, time. In fact, I think it's safe to say it was sort of set in another world entirely, but the technology was not there. It was not as advanced. It was a bit more just old-fashioned, I guess. And I kind of struggled, and as I was beginning to, as I was expanding the story, I began to struggle more and more with the question of setting, and what time period we were in. And I think I don't know, and I can't really put my finger, but I do remember coming to a point where I realized, I wanted to set it in the present day. It was a lot more speculative than it currently is. There were other, fantastical elements. There were humans that had special abilities and things like that. And as I was working on it, I realized the themes were coming, and they were becoming, more interesting and so rich, and just more interesting for me to sort of try to wade through. And I felt all these speculative elements were competing, and so I began to strip them away until the only speculative element that remained was the gray. And I think with that, it made it easier to just say, I'm going to set this in the present day. I think there's a level of strangeness that has, right? Because that this is a quote unquote a modern world, because the mentions of cell phones and electricity and cars and all of that. but there's still a quaintness to it that, which I like, and I feel like those books that have these kinds of strange words that I really admire. His Dark Materials trilogy is one of those. You're seeing these interesting combination of things, of elements, that you wouldn't necessarily put together, and you just want to sort of come along for the ride. I think those are some of the things that were playing, at the back of my mind.
So let's talk about how the chapters are structured. So before each, you have the name of the character and then the story is told from his perspective. So when you were writing, did you ever think of, instead of writing in the third person, writing in the first person? Why did you choose to focus on each individual character when you were writing? And what were your thoughts around choosing that style of writing the book?
I think when it comes to the question of like certain craft choices, one thing I struggled with was what was tense. I think there's an iteration of it that was completely in the present tense. But from the get-go, even when it was only a single character piece, as a short story, it was all in the third person. And as I began to expand it, I think it became an opportunity. I felt it was an opportunity to sort of try to look at this world through the different eyes of the characters, and most because I think they were at such different points in their lives. And I was interested in the idea of looking at the same events, certain things from different perspectives. I was interested in that kind of dynamic and seeing what kinds of insights, that might yield. So there was also a question of the idea of how to structure the book itself. And it just seemed very, very appealing to me that if I was able to write compellingly through the eyes of each character, I would have a book that had an interesting structure. Because sometimes you have these pure ideas about how you would want to do certain things. And sometimes, not that it doesn't necessarily work, but you kind of come to a point where you have to make compromises for the greater good, right, of the work, and not just for that particular component. So I had certain ideas about the way I wanted the structure. There was a certain kind of symmetry I had imagined, but I had to sort of put some of these things aside. But yeah, essentially, I was just interested in looking at the same event, from through the eyes of different characters.
So I'm so ready to talk about the characters. My favorite character in the book is Arit. I could relate with, being an outsider in not exactly fitting in a context, her being older than her classmates, and then also being failed by the adults in her life. And in that space, she still found a way to be compassionate. And every time she came up, I was just like, so I think that she's an amazing character. And I would like to know, what character was the easiest for you to write and which was the most difficult?
Maybe because that was the character I started with, and the one that I've stayed the longest with, which is Duncan's character. In a way, he kind of just sort of flowed onto the page. And of course, he bookends the story, right? So there are certain experiences, I think, that I borrowed from my own life, and just even questions around sort of being male, being a son, being a first son, and the responsibilities that come with that, So I think that some of those were transferred, right, to Dunka. I think Arit was a particularly difficult character because a lot of the things in her life, a lot of her own experiences, and some of the bad things that happened to her. I think it was particularly because I'm also writing across the gender line, right? But you're also writing about blatant misogyny and things like that, resorting to certain tired tropes, whether I was being lazy, whether I was being true, honestly, to her character. That was a process. And I remember there was a version of the book that a friend of mine read, and she sent me like a big, a very needed, a very needed sort of strongly worded, feedback about certain things and so those kinds of things really kept me on my toes, and I was constantly worried that I just wouldn't do it well.
Well, from an Arid fan, you did amazing. I do love her character. I'm so glad she got to be a part of the story in such an interesting way. I would like to know, since you have a background in writing for TV, what are your thoughts about such a beautiful thing to behold being adopted for the big screen? I know my thoughts, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are about that being a
I
possibility.
will tell you my thoughts if as long as you promise to tell me yours after. I'm always asking myself this question, particularly because as someone who has had some experience working in film and TV. But one fantasy I have is, I don't know if you're familiar with Studio Ghibli, but this Japanese animation company, and these films that they put out there. And they have these exquisite, particularly, one of the animators, Miyazaki, he has these interesting things where you look at them and you think, oh, they're for children. But there's an incredible, a lot of them feature child characters, but there's an incredible complexity and nuance, in the storytelling that adults, in my humble opinion, this book might be an interesting candidate, for a Studio Ghibli film because it features children, but at the same time, it's also talking about very, very, very serious, very dark things and things that have to do with the human nature. So that's a fantasy I have. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
I'm inclined to agree with you. I just have to say, you had an interview with Deborah Kalb, and you mentioned that your current work in progress is the oldest meaningful idea you have had as a writer. So, would you like to give us a sneak peek into that?
I've been working on this thing. I think I mentioned that it's set in the desert. It was like a globe-trotting adventure that featured, a ton of characters. And about 90 or 95% of those characters were white. And so my own reaction was to want to really write something that was, a bit more rooted in my own experiences and where I came from. And that's when I started working on my second attempt at a novel. Themes and everything, and they were very personal to me. But after I'd sort of done, certain draft over a number of years, I felt it wasn't very good. And that's when I stepped away and I wanted to work more in short fiction. But over the years, I realized that those themes and those ideas and the heart of that story just never went away. And it's something, that I've tried to revisit a number of times over the years in different ways. So my current work in progress is a way of I'm trying to resurrect those ideas and those themes, and themes around particularly masculinity and male relationships, of course, within like familial settings. For a reason that I cannot entirely explain, the desert is a big part of the story. It's a huge theme in it, and I think that's all I'll say about it. But hopefully with time, I think more light will be shed on it.
Absolutely. We look forward to that. So I like that you mentioned having had the opportunity to be a part of Chimamanda's workshop. And she talked about your story, your short story, and she said, I loved this beautiful recollection of childhood, the loss and yearning, the restraints that never descends to coyness, the honesty and humanity. It was an utter pleasure to read and edit. So you've talked about how being published validated your passion to write. I would like to know, and I'm sure other people will too as well, who are your literary influences? Who are the people you love to read and look up to?
I like to describe myself as a very promiscuous reader. So I feel like I'm kind of all over the place. I've had Tolstoy at a point, Leo Tolstoy, the Russian writer, and War and Peace is one of my favorite books. More recently, the works of the writings of Ian McEwan, of course, Philip Pullman, who I'd mentioned, the poetry of Chris Abani. There was a time when that was kind of all I was reading. So currently, I feel like I'm in a Cormac McCarthy phase, and I've just been reading, and All the Pretty Horses is, I don't know, it's just, I think it's such an incredible achievement of literature. And there's a way that it combines things, I think, that going sort of by what you would consider literary, quote unquote, literary, that may not necessarily seem combinable, but there's a way he does it, and I really love that. I remember 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is definitely an essential text for me. It was a life-changing read. I mean, I could go on and on.
So, writing is often a solitary sport, but do you have mentors and do you have support for your writing? You mentioned how your mother supported you when you were younger, when you started the journey. So, do you have mentors and support for your writing? And do you think these are important for an aspiring writer, and how important do you think they are?
Support and I guess community would be a good word, right? It's community is always essential, no matter what you're doing, even something that can be as lonely as writing. I've had the good fortune of retaining a lot of relationships, even from the writing workshop, the Farfina, creative writing workshop. I've had a lot of relationships from that. A lot of friends, that we read each other's work, and we're kind of constantly just holding each other accountable. I'm currently in an MFA program. I have new relationships that have just been a blessing, and again, you're just bouncing people with whom you bounce ideas, off of each other. So I've been quite fortunate, and I think it's definitely essential, because sometimes you really need to step away from the work. You need to hear from other people, what it's looking like, what it's sounding like. You need those extra pairs of eyes, right? Because it just makes, I think it makes you a better writer, makes your work richer.
If you had the opportunity to address a room full of aspiring writers, I'm sure there are aspiring writers here today, what would you tell aspiring writers?
Particularly as someone who has had some experiences in film, the fact that if you have the desire to write and you have like the wherewithal, that really the ability to sit in front of a blank page and write something and put something there that was never there before, it's a huge privilege, and that honestly nothing is stopping you. If I wanted to make a film, I would need money, I would need other people, but as a writer, I think part of what makes it special is that even though, yes, like I've said, you need community, but the work starts with you, right? And you're the only person that gets in the way of the work. You're the only, you are the one that determines whether the work gets done or not. And to be able to sit with a blank page and create something and put it on the page and write it and then have people read it, it's an incredible privilege and power as well. I think people need to write more. I think people that want to write just need to write more. They need to sit down and pick up the pen, open, the Word document or whatever you use, and really just write. And once you've written, send the work out, do whatever editorial processes you need to go through, and send the work out. Put your best foot forward, because you honestly never know where the work is going to go. You don't know how far it's going to travel, and you are the only person that can determine. Of course, there's so much that's outside your control, but you have so much power, I think, as one person.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm sure they're listening, and hopefully we'll get a few more writers in the coming months and years. So, in closing, I would like you to read for us your favorite part of the book, Such a Beautiful Thing to Behold.
One of my favorite characters in the book is Rit, and I particularly enjoyed writing about her experiences and the ways in which she tries to be a grown-up. In many ways, she is the glue that holds the family together. When everybody's kind of going off doing their own thing, she is the one that says, I'm going to stay. I'm not going to abandon this ship no matter what happens. That evening, they made dinner and shared some of the meat with the others. After they had returned from delivering the meal, Rit and Tongrut went to bed while Tongzum remained outside. Rit lay beside Tongrut. It was the only way to get her to fall asleep, even if she was not ready for bed herself. When the little girl was breathing soundly, Rit got up again. Tongzum was where they had left him, on the steps outside the kitchen. Rit settled beside him. Did you dig that pit all by yourself? Uncle Zumji already dug it. He laid the trap. I just found the pig. Crickets were chirping from secret places around them, but Rit wanted to hear more than that. She wanted to hear all about Tongzum's day. What had happened when he went with her brothers? Had they hit it off? And she wanted to tell him about hers, about the girl from the other side and the way she seemed like she had always belonged in this world. How she, the newcomer, had led them around the village and opened their eyes to the possibilities that existed behind the closed doors of Pilam's empty houses. She wanted to tell him that her palms and knees still stung from yesterday's fall, and that she had absorbed the pain into her body, refusing to give it away. She wanted them to talk about the pig, about all that blood. They could even joke about the two of them being the worst hunters in the history of hunters. Then again, she sensed that Tongzum would not find that funny. He would consider it a failure of some sort, and then he would punish himself and force himself to work harder. She saw it all, the ways he was stretching himself beyond all that he was. He would never accept that the responsibilities he had taken on were a bit too large, that it was okay to fail sometimes and to laugh at oneself. What would it take to make him loosen up, to relax? I want you to stay, Tongzum said. Rit looked at him, unsure of what she was hearing. I'm sorry I made you think I wanted you to leave and go back to your parents' house. I want you to stay here with me, Antong wrote. The idea dropped into Rit's head with a soft splash. It took control of her faculties. It took her entire body. She did not care what her mother would have said. She leaned into Tongzum and kissed him, ever so gently on the cheek, right on one of his stings. She pulled back and watched him, even though her heart was pounding, deafening her in the process. Night had fallen, but she could tell that his face had lit up, as if she had reached out and flicked on a light. In the darkness, he turned his head in her direction. She had often thought about the garden in the intervening days, how the basic sight of growing vegetables had taken her breath away and wrung tears out of her. She thought she had seen and felt it all. She thought that there was nothing left that was capable of surprising her in this world. But here she sat, confused under the stars, for something alive and untamable had taken root in her.
It has been such an incredible honor having conversation with you. I'm so excited to just go and read the book again and reacquaint myself with Pilam and with the beautiful red tree and all the characters. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for honoring us with your presence today. And we look forward to having you subsequently when our desert book is out. Thank you so much, Umar. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Sharon. It was nice talking to you.
Thank you. So that's it from us here. Enjoy the rest of the event. So we will go straight to the Q&A. We want to see if a few people have questions for you so that we can have that experience as well.
Okay, so I listened to the conversation, and I'm also a huge fan of Studio Ghibli because I was just talking about that with my seatmate here. And I wanted to just ask, like, what elements from the Studio Ghibli movies do you like really love, and which bits of that did you
Thank you for that question. I think, I kind of touched a little bit on the fact that there's something about the Studio Ghibli films that a lot of it is told, it's essentially from, children's perspectives, but there's still a lot of, wisdom and a lot of insight that is gained from that. And they also tackle, very dark and sometimes very difficult subject matters. One that particularly stands out for me is Princess Mononoke. And it was just interesting how, I don't know if you've seen that, but it was interesting how themes around environmentalism, even colonialism, resource extraction were all kind of woven in. But the protagonists, the protagonists were all, they were like warriors and they were leaders, but they were also kids at the same time. So I really like that. funny enough, I came to Studio Ghibli quite late, and it was actually after I had even, I think, finished the book that, I kind of dove into that. So.
She says thank you. So our next question.
Okay. Hi, sir. I've been a really big fan of all your writing, non-fiction included, fiction included. I've read The Shapes of Loss. I've read your short story, Her, and many other of your stories. And I would have loved to meet you in person. But I just have a quick question. What is it that motivates or drives you when you're writing? Like, sometimes you have that feeling that I want to give up. Is there anything in your life or somebody that pushes you to go on to continue writing despite the difficulties you face? Is there any source of motivation for you?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is deadlines. When they come up, they have a way of, whipping me into shape. Suddenly all laziness kind of vanishes, and I have work to do and I sit down and I get it done. So deadlines are really helpful. And sometimes what I do is I intentionally commit to a deadline, even if it's impossible. And so far, I think I've been able to kind of get away with that. In recent times, especially since I got married, and I became a father, my family now, I think my family is becoming a big part of just that sort of backdrop, to my writing, I think.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you,
you,
Mark.
sir.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Good day. I'm Chinelo. As a cover-influenced reader, sometimes your cover is so beautiful. I want to know what influenced it.
Oh, thank you. For those who have read the book, it's it's inspired by the flame tree, which is it's a visual motif that runs throughout the story. So the designer wanted to take that and kind of run with it, but at the same time we also wanted to have some tension on the cover, because even though the book in a very upside down kind of way talks about beauty, there's so much darkness in it and there's a lot of tension. So we didn't want a cover that was just beautiful, full stop. We wanted a bit of that darkness as well reflected on it. And so I think that's why you see some of the almost like a dissipation of color, on certain parts of it. If you've held the book and looked at the cover.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umar. We would have loved to have you here sign a few books, but we're so grateful that you were able to join us at 3 a.m. The Kabafest crowd says thank you. We're applauding. Thank you so much. And we hopefully look forward to seeing you subsequently.
So now